Some stories in history feel like warped mirrors. When we peer into them, what looks back is both absurd and bitter. We tend to remember kings and queens for their glittering thrones, their magnificent palaces, and their earth-shaking wars. But there are also names buried in the dust, figures who linger quietly like an off-key note in a grand symphony, so faint that if we do not pay attention, we might believe they never existed at all. One such shadow is Berengaria of Navarre, a queen of England, yet she never once set foot in England. A wife, though rarely acknowledged as one. A pawn on the vast chessboard of politics, left stranded mid-game, forgotten by those who had once moved her into place. History calls her the Forgotten Queen, but in truth, that title is kinder than the reality she endured. A queen without a throne, without land, without love. And sometimes we are left wondering, did she ever truly have a life of her own? Her story does not begin in London, nor within the towers of Westminster, but in a small kingdom pressed between France and Spain, Navarre. From this unassuming place came a gentle, intelligent young woman, scarcely noticed by the world, who was suddenly swept into the roaring tides of Europe during the age of the Crusades. She was married, they say, to one of England's most formidable kings, Richard the Lionheart. Yet, if marriage were a melody, Berengaria's was composed almost entirely of sorrowful notes, for though she bore the title Queen of England, she never once crossed the threshold of the realm she was meant to call her own. So what twist of fate turned her life into a cruel jest of history? How could a queen be so thoroughly erased? And why, in an age filled with commanding Eleanors and cunning Isabellas, does Berengaria appear so utterly lost, like a shadow with no substance? This is not a tale of scandalous affairs or whispered treacheries. It is the scandal of being forgotten, of a queen with a name but no kingdom, with a title but no reality. This is the story of Berengaria of Navarre, the Queen of England who never saw England. If you open a map of medieval Europe, your eyes will instantly be drawn to the vast empires, the Capetian dynasty of France, the sprawling Holy Roman Empire stretching from Germany down to Italy, and of course, Richard the Lionheart's Angevin Empire, covering half of France and all of England. But pause for a moment and let your finger trace a tiny speck hidden in the Pyrenees, where steep mountains divide France from Spain. There, almost forgotten, lies a miniature kingdom, a name that today many have never even heard of, Navarre. Navarre was like a lost child wandering among giants, small, fragile, yet never fully consumed, protected by the rugged mountains that sheltered it. This was once a crossroads of holy wars between Christians and Muslims, a place where Latin, Basque, and Arabic mingled together. It was at once a cramped chamber inside an overcrowded castle and a neglected alleyway, one that everyone peered into, but no one bothered to care for. And in this little room of history, sometime in the late 12th century, a girl was born, Berengaria, daughter of Sancho VI, the king known as the Wise. The title sounds grand, almost lofty, but do not be deceived. Wisdom did not make him powerful. Sancho of Navarre, no matter how clever, was a ruler who survived by walking a tightrope between far greater powers. His throne was held together less by armies than by his silver tongue and carefully arranged marriages. Berengaria grew up in a large family. Her brother, Sancho VII, was a towering figure, famous for his nickname El Fuerte, the Strong. People said his shadow stretched across the castle walls, but shadows cannot defend a kingdom. For all his height, Navarre remained fragile, as breakable as glass, caught between the might of the north and the ambitions of the south. Berengaria, unlike her brother, left no image of greatness in chronicles. Instead, history remembers her as gentle, modest, even reserved. Yet in those days, a princess was not meant to be remembered for her personality. A princess existed to be married off. Every smile she gave, every braid tied neatly into her hair, was not for herself, but to serve as a display piece in the great marketplace of diplomacy. And yet Navarre, being what it was, poor, small, with no treasure to its name, possessed one thing worth fighting over: geography. Its location made its daughters, like Berengaria, unexpectedly precious. This little scrap of land sat at the crossroads of Europe, pressed between a hungry France in the north and the rising powers of Castile and Aragon in the south. Navarre could be crushed at any moment, yet at the same time, it was a card that every great king wanted to hold in his hand. So Berengaria grew up not only behind the cold stone walls of Pamplona or Tudela, but also in the charged atmosphere of ceaseless political scheming. She was taught to pray, to embroider, to embody the pious gentleness of a well-bred princess. But behind that facade, her destiny was already sealed. She was a bridge, a living tool, meant to buy her kingdom one more generation of survival. And here lies the paradox. Precisely because Navarre was so small, Berengaria became all the more valuable. A French princess could be just another pawn among many, an English one discarded amidst countless sisters. But a Navarrese princess? That was different. To marry her was to secure a fragile buffer state, to silence one battlefield in Europe's endless chess match. Now, place yourself in the mind of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most formidable woman in Europe at the time, mother of Richard the Lionheart. Eleanor had long since mastered the art of political marriage, forging alliances and even provoking wars with nothing more than a wedding contract. When she looked toward Navarre, she did not see a poor, fragile land. She saw an opportunity, a gentle, obedient princess, untainted by ambition, the perfect match for her wild and uncontrollable son, Richard. And so, from the narrow valleys of Navarre, Berengaria's life was pushed onto a path no one could have foreseen. A small princess from a kingdom that barely existed on the map was about to become queen of a realm stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Yet the cruel twist was this: she would be one of the strangest queens in history. A queen with no throne, no land, and who never once set foot in the kingdom she was meant to rule. Perhaps, had she been born elsewhere, Berengaria would have been nothing more than a forgotten name, a faint line in Navarre's genealogy. But fate, in its irony, turned her into a living paradox, the queen of a country she never saw. And it all began with Navarre, a kingdom no bigger than a speck of dust, yet powerful enough to change the course of one woman's destiny. History has its own kind of cruelty. It often takes ordinary people, throws them into extraordinary circumstances, and reduces them to pawns on a vast chessboard. Few felt this more deeply than Berengaria of Navarre, whose life was suddenly bound to the name Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, the famed warrior king of England. We often like to dress up royal marriages as stories of love, but in Berengaria's case, there was no romance at all. There were only political hands arranging the pieces, and one formidable woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine, pulling the strings. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a force that loomed over the 12th century like a giant shadow. She had once been Queen of France, then Queen of England. She had marched on crusade, divorced Louis VII of France, and shaken 2 royal courts with nothing more than her marriages. Even in her 70s, Eleanor showed no signs of fading. She became the architect of her family's future, the iron hand guiding the destiny of the Plantagenets. Her son Richard was not an easy man to control. From childhood, he had been a warrior, arrogant and headstrong, finding his joy in battle rather than in courts or councils. Marriage bored him, women did not hold his attention, and heirs were the last thing on his mind. For Eleanor, this was a dangerous problem. A king without an heir left the throne as fragile as a candle in the wind. So when Eleanor's gaze turned toward Navarre, she saw an answer. Berengaria was not another queenly powerhouse like herself, nor was she a schemer with dangerous ambition. She was gentle, pliable, and most importantly, she was Navarrese, daughter of a small kingdom on Aquitaine's southern border. A marriage alliance with Navarre would secure Richard's lands from attack while he marched off to the Crusades, untroubled by threats at his back. Perhaps for a moment, Berengaria dreamed that this marriage would allow her to step beyond the small, dim shadow of Navarre. But even that hope was never hers to claim. It was written instead in diplomatic letters, land agreements, and the whispered strategies of Eleanor's councils. Berengaria was never the author of her own fate. She was a pawn, moved by someone else's hand. The bitterest truth was that Richard seemed utterly indifferent. Chronicles say he cared little for the marriage, distracted by other interests, and felt no urgency to take a wife. Yet Eleanor, with her iron will, forced his hand. Politics demanded it, and Richard, for all his pride as the Lionheart, could not defy his mother. If you imagine a royal wedding as gilded palaces and endless feasts, erase that thought. Berengaria's wedding unfolded under strange and grim circumstances, amid the chaos of the Crusades on the island of Cyprus. In 1190, Richard set sail for the Holy Land. Eleanor, old and weary but still unyielding, brought Berengaria along, pushing her toward her fate. It was an extraordinary sight. A 70-year-old queen riding across Europe, escorting a young princess to a wedding neither bride nor groom seemed to want. Their fleet was battered by storms and wrecked on the shores of Cyprus, a land Richard had just seized from the rebellious Byzantine prince Isaac Komnenos. And there, in May 1191, among ruins and smoldering wreckage, the wedding was performed. Picture it: makeshift chapels hastily erected, nights still stained with blood from battle, warships smoking on the horizon. In the midst of this, Berengaria stood in her bridal gown beside the most famous warrior in Europe, a man who remained a stranger to her. The wedding was not a celebration of love, but a transaction, the sealing of a political bargain. There was no honeyed promise, only iron and parchment, no words of love, only clauses of alliance. Many historians call it a war wedding, a ceremony that resembled a military treaty more than a union of hearts. The bride was less a wife than a banner, planted to mark territory. And cruelly, even on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, Berengaria was already an outsider in her own story. From that moment, she was Queen of England, at least on paper. Yet even as the title was bestowed upon her, a silent truth took root. Berengaria of Navarre would never set foot in England. In romantic novels, a wedding is the beginning of love, the doorway to a new life. But in history, and especially in the story of Berengaria of Navarre, a wedding could just as easily mark the end of all hope. For the moment she became the wife of Richard the Lionheart, she discovered what everyone else already knew, except her. Richard had no interest in her, nor in anything at all beyond the business of war. Richard the Lionheart is a figure of contradictions. He is remembered as the invincible crusader, the fearless king leading his men to the Holy Land. Yet, look closer, and he appears less a king than a soldier who happened to wear a crown. In nearly 10 years on the throne of England, he spent less than 6 months in the kingdom he ruled. He loved the battlefield more than the throne, the sword more than the palace, and, perhaps, men more than his own wife. Chroniclers recorded that Richard once shared a bed with Philip II of France. In the Middle Ages, such gestures were not unheard of. Monarchs sometimes slept in the same bed to demonstrate friendship. But to many of their contemporaries, the closeness between the two kings seemed to suggest something more than politics. Some historians have gone further, calling Richard openly homosexual. If true, it explains why his marriage to Berengaria was cold from the start. An arrangement? Nothing more, devoid of the slightest spark of intimacy. If Berengaria hoped to find in Richard a companion through marriage, she was gravely mistaken. The proud lion paid her little notice. Even their wedding night, so often emphasized in royal chronicles as proof of a union, barely merited a word. It was as though history itself refused to acknowledge them as husband and wife. Richard left no legitimate children with Berengaria, not because opportunity was lacking, but because he had no inclination to try. Some claimed he fathered illegitimate offspring elsewhere, but even if true, it only underscored the point. Berengaria was never truly his wife in anything but name. She was a shadow trailing behind a king who had no need for her. What made it worse was that Richard hardly bothered to hide his indifference. He poured his devotion into his knights and soldiers, the brothers in arms who fought and bled with him, while Berengaria received only silence. In his rare letters, he spoke of battles, of Jerusalem, of Saladin, almost never of his queen. She became the forgotten wife of a king too consumed by war to notice her. A loveless marriage might still endure if at least there is companionship, but Berengaria was denied even that. She followed Richard on crusade, but only as baggage. On the battlefield, Richard was celebrated for his horse, his sword, his victories at Acre and Arsuf. Berengaria was celebrated for nothing. She was no Eleanor, Richard's formidable mother, who had once ridden at the head of knights during the Second Crusade. Berengaria was merely a young bride, abandoned among tents, lost amid the clash of steel and the smell of blood. When Richard was captured in Austria in 1192 and later handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor for ransom, Berengaria faded from the story almost completely. It was Eleanor, 70 years old and unyielding, who led the campaign to free her son. History remembers her as the indomitable Queen Mother. Berengaria, by contrast, remained a faint shadow, seated in the corner of the page, unnoticed. To Richard, Berengaria was never a wife, but a seal upon a treaty, a name on a contract. When he returned from prison, he made little effort to reunite with her. Even as death approached in 1199, struck down at Chalus, Richard did not call for Berengaria. The hand he held was not his wife's, but his mother's. Berengaria did not lose her husband in the way widows usually do. She had lost him the very day she married him. For the rest of her life, she remained a wife only on parchment, a queen without a throne, a name in chronicles that few remembered. There is a bitter irony in this tale. Berengaria, the daughter of a small and fragile kingdom, rose to become queen of one of the mightiest realms in Europe. And yet that throne never belonged to her. Marriage was supposed to open a new world, but for her, it was only the shutting of a door. Behind it lay no love, no companionship, only an emptiness that stretched across a lifetime. There's a bitter truth we need to face right from the start. Berengaria, though she bore the title Queen of England, never once set foot on English soil. To put it more precisely, she was the queen of a land she only knew through stories, through maps, through coins stamped with the face of her husband, Richard the Lionheart. As for England itself, to her, it remained a distant shadow, a kingdom that never truly opened its arms to welcome her. While Richard lived, this absence was rarely spoken of. He was forever away at war, and she, quietly dutiful, followed his retinue, tucked away in small chambers along pilgrim routes. But when Richard died in 1199, that absence became impossible to ignore. To the church, to the royal court, it was a glaring blemish. Could a queen who had never been present in her kingdom truly be called a queen at all? Berengaria was around 30 then, widowed yet still young. She could have returned to Navarre, to the vineyards of her childhood, to the familiar hills of home. But she did not. Her parents were dead. Her throne back home had passed to others. She stayed in France instead, quietly, anonymously, a widow carrying a grand title stripped of any real power. And from that moment began her strange journey, the struggle to reclaim her place. The cruel irony was that her place existed only on parchment. Richard had left her no children, no estates, no legacy. All of it fell into the hands of his brother, King John, better remembered by history as John Lackland. And to John, Berengaria was nothing more than an inconvenient debt. By law, a queen dowager was entitled to a dower, lands and revenues sufficient to sustain her in dignity. But John, tight-fisted and petty, refused to honor it. Thus began one of the most humiliating chapters in Berengaria's life, a queen forced to beg for her pension. Picture it. A woman who once carried the most glittering title of an empire, reduced to writing letter after letter, pleading with King John, with the Pope, with bishops and nobles alike, simply to claim what was rightfully hers. Many of those letters still survive today. They read like faint cries for help, lost in a world consumed by war and ambition. Always patient, always deferential, Berengaria never raged. Yet between the lines, one can sense the quiet torment of a woman swallowing her grief behind polite words. John not only ignored her, he sometimes flatly refused. He blamed empty coffers, war expenses, even his own supposed poverty. But the truth was plain. John squandered fortunes on feasts, on luxuries, on foolish wars, all while abandoning the widow of the very hero England had once hailed as its lion-hearted king. In some ways, John's cruelty left Berengaria doubly orphaned, without her husband, without her kingdom, without even an ally to speak for her. All that remained was a hollow crown. And yet Berengaria did not surrender. Year after year, she pressed on. In doing so, she became a peculiar kind of symbol, the queen whose only power was persistence. History loves to tell of queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, her formidable mother-in-law, who ruled kingdoms and commanded armies. Berengaria was nothing like that. She issued no orders, won no battles, carved no empire. What she left instead was the quiet portrait of a woman who refused to be erased. Her persistence was not in vain. When King John died in 1216 and the young Henry III took the throne, the tide shifted. Pressured by the church, Henry began to settle the debts owed to Berengaria. It was a late justice, and it could never erase the 2 decades of hardship she had endured. In the eyes of the world, Berengaria would always remain the queen without a throne, a wandering shadow, with no land, no subjects, no kingdom to call her own. In her later years, she withdrew to Le Mans in France, where she lived a life of simplicity and faith. With what little she finally received, she gave generously, founding convents, aiding the poor, devoting herself to charity. Perhaps in the silence of the cloister, she discovered another kind of throne, one built on compassion. The people of Le Mans loved her, calling her the Queen of Mercy, an unofficial title, but one perhaps far more meaningful than the crown of England she never wore. When Berengaria died in 1230, she was buried at Les Pots Abbey, which she herself had founded. Her tomb still stands today, modest yet dignified, and before it, the question still lingers. How did a queen end her life forgotten, abandoned, left to fade into obscurity? The answer may lie in the paradox she embodies. Berengaria was a queen without a throne. She ruled nothing, birthed no heirs, left no victories. And so history, so obsessed with power and noise, almost forgot her. Yet in that very emptiness lies a scandal of its own. That queenship does not always mean power or glory. Sometimes it is nothing more than a title, a shadow carried in someone else's light. If Richard the Lionheart was remembered as the embodiment of valor and strength, then Berengaria of Navarre became the embodiment of silence. A silence that lingers even now, remembered only by historians and storytellers like us. But perhaps within that silence, we hear something essential, that history is not written only by the loud, the mighty, the victorious, but also by the forgotten. Berengaria, queen without throne, without land, without kingdom, yet in the end, queen of memory. And perhaps that is the truest crown of all. If we turn to the final pages of Berengaria's life, what we find is not a climax, but a silence so long and heavy that a reader might almost want to close the book. Gone are the bloody fields of the Crusades, gone are the glittering golden weddings, and what remains is only a widowed woman, quietly battling against time. After the death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199, Berengaria was no longer the queen consort of England. She became something far more ambiguous, a queen without a throne, a widow without children, a forgotten figure in the very world she had once entered as a political pawn. Yet within that obscurity lay a deeper tragedy, one even harsher than her loveless marriage. Berengaria was stripped of her pension and even her most basic entitlements. By custom, a royal widow was granted dower lands, an income and estates to sustain her after her husband's death. But John, Richard's brother and successor to the throne, not only withheld generosity, but ignored his duty altogether. Berengaria became the only queen in English history to be treated in this way, to such an extent that records show she repeatedly wrote letters, pleading with the Pope and European rulers to force the English crown to honor what was rightfully hers. An English queen dependent on the charity of the papacy, history has few examples more bitter than that. For years, Berengaria drowned in debt, so much so that monasteries and religious orders had to take her in. One can almost imagine the scene. A woman with silver already in her hair, pen in hand, drafting long letters sent across Christendom, humbly begging for the money that should have been hers all along. A queen, yet living no better than a pauper of the church. Toward the end of her life, Berengaria found solace not with the English crown, but within the thick walls of a monastery. She settled in Le Mans, France, devoting her days to religion, charity, and the building of churches. If her marriage had been a cold emptiness, then faith became the small flame that warmed her final years. In Le Mans, she founded Les Pots Abbey, a Cistercian house where she at last discovered peace, after nearly half a century of living like a shadow. She died on December 23, 1230, at around the age of 70, an astonishing age in the Middle Ages, when life expectancy rarely passed 40. Her death caused barely a ripple in England, scarcely recorded by contemporary chroniclers. England, it seems, did not even notice that its queen had died in a distant land. She was buried at Les Pots Abbey, where her tomb still stands, a quiet, enduring reminder of a life once erased from memory. So what then was Berengaria's legacy? It is difficult to speak of a legacy in terms of glory. She left no children, wielded no direct political influence, and was not remembered by the English people as a true Queen of England. Yet, it is precisely the void she left behind that forces reflection. In an age when women were remembered only if they bore kings or stirred scandal, Berengaria remains a faint wrinkle on history's face, an invisible queen, a pale name, but one that makes us ask, if even a queen could be forgotten, what of the countless nameless women of her time? Today, when her story is told, it often circles back to one bitter phrase: the only English queen never to set foot in England. It sounds like a cruel joke of history, but in truth, it is history's verdict on a life swallowed by indifference. Perhaps her true legacy is not power or fame, but the reminder that in the thick volumes of history filled with battles and blood, there are still quiet sighs that have been overlooked, and sometimes those sighs echo the loudest of all.